I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International, and you're listening to Order from Ashes. Today we have a great episode with two researchers who have done an amazing deep dive into exactly how Lebanon's IMF economic rescue package has gone awry, who sabotaged it, why, what's at stake, and what, if anything, can Lebanese people who are suffering the consequences of these failures do to change the course of their very unfortunate lot over the last couple of years. So today I'm joined by Sami Zoughaib, who is an economist and the research manager at the Policy Initiative, which is one of the best think tanks in Lebanon, and Sam Heller, our own fellow here at Century International. The two of them, the Sam and Sami, have teamed up on what I think is a kind of bombshell piece of research. We're publishing it as a joint report with the Policy Initiative this month. And what it does is it tells the story of exactly what happened or what is happening behind the scenes under the hood in the negotiations between Lebanon and the IMF, and exactly why this is so important and kind of a whodunit, who's guilty, and why it matters. So Sam and Sami, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Welcome to Order from Ashes.
Thank you, Thanasi. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here.
Sami, start off by telling us exactly where we are right now in the sort of economic catastrophe and human misery geography of Lebanon today, and what is the role of an IMF plan supposed to be in addressing this crisis?
Yeah, well, the situation in Lebanon is really qualified as one of the worst financial and economic catastrophes that the world has really seen since we've been structuring economies in this modern structure that we live in. And so, as you can expect, our currency is pretty much, the Lebanese pound is pretty much worthless, lost 99% of its value. As such, the economy has completely been dollarized, knowing that the people and people's access to dollars is very scarce and sparse. So that has essentially led to an explosion in vulnerabilities. People on every single metric, from poverty to inequality to access to public services and essential services like healthcare and education, have been completely exacerbated by the current situation. So just to run through some of the numbers, the Lebanese economy has essentially shrunk to right about $20 billion today. That's down from $55 billion prior to the crisis. We know that...
And isn't that one of the largest contractions or the most dramatic contractions in an economy in the last 150 years worldwide?
It certainly could be the sharpest contraction that we've seen, really. And also the macroeconomic shock is impacting people's lived realities. And here we have more than half of the population, by the most modest of estimates, living in some form of poverty today. The ESCWA, for example, estimates that around 82% of the population lives in multidimensional poverty. The WFP estimates that around half of the population is living in non-monetary poverty. So we're living really in quite a challenging environment on every single metric, and this can only be described as one of the most major catastrophes that we have really seen.
So people are suffering. Life is really, as we know anecdotally from all kinds of reports, almost unlivable, from lack of healthcare access to difficulty getting protein in people's diets. I mean, everything is affected. So where does the International Monetary Fund come in? What's so important about the talks over this IMF plan?
Really, this sense of economic despair stems really from a shock sustained by Lebanon's financial system, and Lebanon's financial system. Not to really go into the details, but the essential idea is that most of the money that people deposited in the banking sector was then lent to the central bank here in Lebanon, the Banque du Liban, which was then later used to defend an unsustainable peg of the Lebanese pound, essentially, and the banking sector, by lending this money to the central bank, has essentially was making very large profits, and with it were the large depositors who were making a pretty good buck out of this process. This has led to Lebanon having some levels of indebtedness, sovereign indebtedness, that are probably unforeseen prior to today. One of the numbers that is most shocking for me, for example, is that the losses that have been estimated by the IMF that exist in the financial sector, and more specifically in the balance sheet of the central bank, is about $70 billion. That is around more than 3 times the size of the economy. So essentially, this is a problem of debt. This is a problem of financial mismanagement, fiscal mismanagement, etc., etc. So naturally, the country requires very hard, structural, deep economic reforms that can set it back on a path of sustainability, both in terms of its debt, but also in terms of its growth model. And while this could be achieved through a responsible government, the IMF is certainly a natural partner in these instances, because the IMF not only brings with it the conditionality element and that incentivizes discipline and incentivizes the government to then commit and to the reforms that should be taken, but it also offers technical assistance, which is very important, because these are very serious challenges that require a lot of knowledge, and the IMF certainly has in its capacity a lot of experience for other countries on how to handle challenges like Lebanon sustaining today. And also on the third level, and for me the least important, would be that the IMF would then unlock a certain liquidity package that it could give Lebanon as a loan, and with it, which would sit at around $3 billion, and with it extra financing from other donors, such as other governments or other international financial institutions or international NGOs. So this would really help Lebanon be put back on a track that could lead it again to grow and pull it out of the current spiral of death that it's in.
Okay, so as I understand, you said here, and I read in your work, Lebanon as a state, and the Lebanese people as people who are trying to survive, they're really only their only viable hope of getting out of this miserable situation they're in is the pressure, know-how, and money that would come with an IMF package. And I understand you don't like the word bailout. That's the word, as a 50-year-old who's seen, many cycles of these kinds of plans coming in to different countries, including the first place I covered one of these, which was Greece in the 90s, we always called them bailouts, but I'll defer to whatever economic sophistication makes us not want to use that term. And so I want to turn to Sam and ask you to explain to us what is the setup of these negotiations. Like, so here we are. Sami has explained why this is so critically important. This IMF package needs to happen, or else Lebanese people suffer. There's no chance of making any of the needed reforms, and there's no access to the money needed to bail out, sort of help the country recover from the irresponsibility of its banks and elites. So what is the structure of these negotiations, and why has that actual structure of negotiations led to problems of its own?
Well, first, I think it's important to add that, in addition to the importance of Lebanon entering into an IMF program, to note that, as it stands, Lebanon is not going to get an IMF program, right? Because Lebanon, it reached a preliminary, what's called a staff level agreement with the IMF in April of last year. Now, that would pave the way for a full agreement and entrance into an IMF program. but only subject to the implementation of like roughly 10, depending on how you count them, structural reforms beforehand, called prior actions. And then in the more than a year since, Lebanon has accomplished almost none. Again, it depends who you ask, but then I think that the count is somewhere between 1 and 3 of these prior actions have been accomplished. So the question then, and I think what we were trying to answer in the course of this of doing this research was why, right? I mean, like, why hasn't this worked properly?
Right. Why is a country that's suffering a huge emergency and would, from at first blush, you'd assume this country really wants this package to come. They want these negotiations to work out because otherwise, the country's going to fail. So that's the sort of starting point of an observer. So what do you find? What do you find that helps us understand why, in fact, maybe they're less interested, or some parts of the country are less interested in having these negotiations work out than we would assume, or than we might assume?
Well, so it turns out, that the main problem, the base problem here is just a lack of will and interest among the country's political elites, or this sort of merged political financial elite, that sits atop the country, who evidently, much as they might profess their commitment to achieving an IMF program, are evidently not that pressed, right? They very clearly do not feel substantial urgency to accomplish this. And then, so that it manifests in, I think, what we identified as kind of two main dysfunctions. And then one of them relates to the way that Lebanon's IMF talks are organized. The issue here is that so these talks, they are based primarily on engagement between the IMF and Lebanon's official negotiating team, headed by Deputy Prime Minister sabotaged. Now, this team, on paper, includes a number of key economic policymakers, but in practice, seems like it's basically just Sami. He's on his own. I think people who deal with him say that he's doing his best, right? He gets generally positive reviews for his seriousness, his competence, but he's kind of on an island, and it means that that he agreed with the IMF on an economic recovery plan and a staff level agreement on that basis, and has worked with them to formulate essential reform legislation that do not have the buy-in of Lebanon's elites, who are not invested in a recovery plan that many of them call the Sami plan, who are not motivated to execute prior reforms, and then who are hostile to reforms that would menace some of their real material interests.
So essentially, this deputy PM who's in charge of the negotiations does not actually have the power to speak for the government. And in fact, a lot of the powerful constituencies in the government and in the economy oppose the very reforms that he's supposedly trying to negotiate to implement. So structurally, he's set up to fail, as I understand it from your work, because he's working in good faith, presumably with these IMF experts, to detail the top 10 things or more that Lebanon needs in order to recover economically, but actually the people who hold decision-making power inside Lebanon's political structure or sort of parallel power structure don't want any of these things, any of these reforms to be implemented, because those reforms would take away their very livelihoods and rentier sources of profit.
Yeah, basically. I mean, now we should note that I think that the IMF, it seems like they've recognized some of the issue here, and then they've attempted to adapt to the way that Lebanon's politics are set up. So the IMF, their mandate is to deal with national authorities. In most countries, authorities are executive agencies. In Lebanon, they've defined that much more broadly, right? So they've defined it to include heads of key parliamentary committees, and then more recently, and what is actually one of the few reasons for optimism, I think, they've had a kind of a running dialogue with a cross-party group of parliamentarians to whom they've been able to convey directly, some of their expectations, their requirements for any reform legislation. But the Lebanese political system is fragmented. It is unwieldy. It is it's loaded with veto players, and then there are pretty clearly essential decision makers in the system that are that say that they want an IMF program, but that really don't.
We're talking with Sam Heller and Sami Zoughaib about their research into Lebanon's IMF negotiations and the apparent sabotage of those negotiations by Lebanon's political elite and what the consequences of that are. I'm Thanassi Kambanis. This is Order from Ashes, Century International's podcast. We'll be right back after this break.
Today's world is changing faster than ever. Old rules don't apply, and the new rules haven't been written. At least not yet. I'm Rohan Advani, and I produce the Order from Ashes podcast at the Century Foundation, a leading progressive think tank that promotes peace, cooperation, and equality at home and abroad. On Order from Ashes, we try to make sense of a new international system in which America no longer dictates the global order. Join us as we talk to activists and analysts on the front lines of the most pressing issues in international policy.
Welcome back. I'm Thanassi Kambanis, and I'm talking today with Sami Zoughaib and Sam Heller about Lebanon's economic collapse and the IMF talks that appear to have been stalled, maybe to death, by Lebanon's elites. And before the break, we were talking about the structure of these negotiations, which really reflects Lebanon's political dysfunction, the way in which a sort of coterie or oligarchy of vested interests and Zu'ama, warlords, bosses, however you want to translate that, really make the decisions and not necessarily the officials at the top of the government, like the prime minister and the deputy prime minister. And now I want to turn to you, Sami, to actually talk to us a little bit about some of the substance of these reforms that aren't going to happen. So a year ago, the staff level agreement roughly a year ago was reached. Since then, these negotiations have been put in the deep freeze. I want you to, if you can, sort of quickly tell us what are the proposed reforms that this elite is resisting so hard? And then I want to ask you what kinds of dirty tricks or other strategies this elite has used to try and kill the negotiations.
Yeah, thank you. I think the Lebanese political class is really allergic to any kind of reform, not these reforms in particular. And we know that because we see a dismal performance of Lebanon's political class with any reforms project going back 30 years. But today I think there's larger things at stake that push us to really think that the moving forward with these reforms will be highly unlikely. One of the obvious ones, and not to really go into a list of any sorts, would be a banking restructuring act, and this really is, at the essence of the Lebanese economic crisis, because this banking restructuring act is essentially a formula by which you define who would be bearing the brunt of the incredible losses that have been sustained in the financial sector. We know that this has been borne by the Lebanese population at large through inflation and through the fact that Lebanese people do not have access to their deposits, and that they have to withdraw their deposits at a very, $1, 1 cent to the dollar, etc., in terms of real value. And now this Banking Restructuring Act has to really materialize in some way. And the IMF has a very hard stance on how banks in Lebanon can be restructured and how these financial losses should be distributed. The essential idea and principle behind this would be one that says that that private losses should not be sustained by public assets. And I think this is one of the main key schism points that exist. The Lebanese political class, or at least much of it, are really pushing towards this idea of covering these losses through the use of Lebanese public assets.
They're socializing private irresponsibility, and
absolutely.
I know you're more delicate and you don't like to put it this way, and that's great. But what I conclude from this work is that the political elite is intertwined with these banks. They either own them directly and in any case are profiting from them, and they just don't want to lose a dollar. So they drove the country into catastrophe, and they have found a way so far successfully to displace any of those losses onto poor schmoes, poor people, middle-class people, unconnected people. And meanwhile, the actual wealthy and connected people who had dollar assets or even Lebanese lira assets, they aren't suffering. They got to protect their money. They got to move it abroad in time, or they get to still withdraw it, while people like you and your colleagues are the ones who lose 99% of your life savings as a result of something that was not your fault.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this really pushes me into maybe adding to what Sam was saying regarding the attitude that the political class has with these negotiations, is that, for me, it really transcends passive nonchalance and goes into an area of active malignancy, in which this political class is really pushing forward to protect its interests, which are very much elite capitalist interests, if one can say, at the expense of society and at the expense of really the future of this country as we know it.
And now get into this thing you two documented, and it's kind of chilling, the narrative and sort of political the political narrative that the banks and the elite have put forward in order to, one, sabotage these talks, and two, try and present an IMF deal as somehow unnecessary or an infringement on Lebanese sovereignty or whatever it is that they're trying to peddle as the justification for scuttling what you two describe as Lebanon's best chance for salvaging itself.
Yeah, I think the main issue is that a lot of people come to Lebanon and they say, okay, if this happened anywhere else in the world, people would be on the street, people would be protesting, things would not be as peaceful as things are perceived to be today in Lebanon. And let me tell you, things are peaceful in Lebanon. But at the end of the day, the political class and the banks, which are one unit at the end of the day, have a third arm, and that arm is really the Lebanese media and their control over public discourse in the country. They have a monopoly over public discourse, and through this public discourse, they have been able to weaponize narratives to push people to think that one, to give them toxic hope, around the fate of the deposits. I know that a lot of people in Lebanon now who have sustained losses, who have essentially, lost their money in the banking sector, still believe that there is a small chance that some Saudi prince will come forward and will give money to the Lebanese government, and they will get their
Hope
deposit
springs
back.
eternal, but the wrong kind.
Absolutely. So I think these narratives have been very, very dangerous, and maybe I will allow Sam to go maybe through them one by one. But I think one that I would like to dwell on a bit is the issue that you hear it everywhere, and you hear it even in the most senior circles in the country, that the country has reached an equilibrium and that the country is growing. And we've heard this being said by our very prime minister, who said that the Lebanese economy is growing. And last week we heard it from a central bank governor who said that he is being prosecuted in France, not because of the fact that he embezzled money from the central bank, but because there are political entities that are angry at him because he has been able to spur growth and stabilize the lira at 100,000 Lebanese pounds a dollar. These are literally things that are being said, and these are things that some people are being driven to believe. And I think this idea of equilibrium is one that creates a sort of schism with requiring accountability for the past, and then says, okay, let's clean up the slate, and what happened. Let's now think how we can move forward. And I think this is the most deeply troubling part or narrative that is now, to be honest, for me, might actually be controlling the overall rhetoric in the country.
Right. So they're successfully, to a population that's like living in the rubble of their needlessly shattered economy. They're saying, hey, actually things are going great. We're growing again. And the world doesn't like us because we were such cowboys that we managed to defy like their Western consensus to make us do X, Y, and Z. So even though that's BS, that gives them potentially enough political cover to get away with what is essentially a major crime that was perpetrated by the elite against the Lebanese public and its bank deposits. So Sam Heller, there's so much detail in your work, and we're going to have to skate over some of that in order to get in and out of this podcast anywhere close to half an hour. So Sam Heller, I want to turn to you and skip ahead to the idea of this shadow plan, which is what happens if, as the elite seems to intend, if there isn't an IMF package and things muddle forward the way they have been over the last year plus since the terms of reform were announced and then essentially scuttled. So what's the default in the absence of an IMF program?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So it's not like the shadow plan. I mean, which, it's a term that other people have come up with, and then we thought it was evocative. But it's not an if, right? I mean, like, it's what's happening. It's what's been happening basically since the outset of Lebanon's crisis in 2019. And what it means, I mean, so it's premised centrally on Lebanon's commercial banks cleaning up their balance sheets by discharging their foreign currency liabilities, the deposits of ordinary Lebanese.
So you write off people's life savings in order to clear off your balance sheet.
Yeah. And then, but in the meantime, right, I mean, so that's a big part of it, which I guess apparently can, people say that eventually that can achieve some balance on their ledgers. But then in the meantime, the country's, its economy stays unproductive. It's increasingly a cash economy, which fosters tax evasion, illicit activity. Much of the state withers away. I think we're already seeing, that kind of key institutions of the state, including institutions that are really important to to executing on an IMF program and then achieving some eventual recovery, like the Ministry of Finance. That the institutions are just sort of fading away, right? They're atrophying, or they're being, starved.
These are all trends that are terrible for governance and terrible for the lived experience of Lebanese people, but maybe are excellent outcomes for folks who run unaccountable smuggling rings and embezzlement and extortion rackets, which are the bread and butter of the Lebanese political elite. So there is a real divergence of interests between the people, most people who live in Lebanon, and the tiny community of folks who have unaccountably ruled over them since the Civil War.
Well, I think that my sense would be that less that the country's ruling elite stands to benefit substantially from this, and then more that they're just like, to a large extent, insulated, unaffected. Because their interests lie elsewhere, right? I mean, they are not they don't line up with the interests of the broader Lebanese public, and then so they continue to live relatively comfortably, and then so that's another big part of the shadow plan of like where the country is heading, is that this growing chasm between an elite, I've heard it called a dollar class, people who have the resources to survive, to thrive, and then a majority of the country that just sinks deeper into poverty, that is further marginalized, and that is sustained to a large extent by aid and by remittances from abroad, from the country's now growing diaspora, because people, can't live in it, and so they're leaving. Which, for a lot of the people who are in charge, I think that seems like it's an outcome that is, that is acceptable.
So I want to end this conversation by turning back to you, Sami Zoughaib, to address this question of what can be done, what people can do. And I do just want to flag what I think is so important and new about the work you two have done here is, when we look at what's happened in Lebanon since the revolution and the economic collapse, it's easy to get distracted by the sort of circus-like atmosphere of the different corrupt officials and the many twists and turns of these things, and to think like, well, it's a mess, and it's sort of just it just happened like a meteor landing on the earth and creating a new weather pattern. But in fact, it is not. It's not a natural disaster. It is not an accident. It is not a chaotic circus. It is a series of intentional bad choices made by people who you two have taken the pains to chart in great detail in the report that you've published. So we can see that this is not neither vague nor chaotic nor a disaster. It is a intentional set of decisions made by people who are working quite hard to try and deflect responsibility and escape from the blame. And I think that is such an important contribution to our understanding this crisis, because one, it makes us see how it happened. Two, it at least opens the door to imagining possible remediations, right? So that if we understand this is a series of choices and actions by identifiable people and figures, public figures with public responsibilities, we can at least imagine how it could come to pass that those people are held accountable and their mistakes are remediated. So that said, to you, Sami Zoughaib, to close us off with your findings about what can be done.
Thank you for the great remarks. I think really what can be done, what we're trying to do with this paper is essentially one of the core arguments that we make in regards to what should be done and can be done moving forward. This paper really, as you're saying, is trying to communicate to people the reality of what is happening and how it's happening in order for people to be able to decide and claim agency. And people are free to do with this information what they want. And I think here it takes us to the essential theme of communication, which is a burden on the IMF. One of the burdens of the IMF its engagement in Lebanon is to be able to communicate more publicly, more courageously, more boldly with the Lebanese public, and tell them exactly how things are going and why they are going in the way that they are. And this is one of the things that we recommend. And the other thing is that the Lebanese civil society actors in Lebanon, like TPI, like other institutions in Lebanon, like even the Century Foundation, Century International, and many other actors that exist in this country who are really going forward towards the good of Lebanon, to them, they themselves keep on equipping people with the necessary information about what is going on, and center people as their main interlocutor, because it's only people that can really push things forward and fight back against what has been what is being practiced against them. On another theme, I think that we touched upon the issue of the Lebanese bureaucracy, and the fact that the Lebanese bureaucracy has all but collapsed due to the crisis. And naturally, without a bureaucracy, little can really be done in order to push forward any kind of reform program, because you do, for any policy to take shape, you do need the institutions behind it to do it. And in this view, it's important that assistance be channeled towards expanding and resuscitating the Lebanese administration and equipping it with the necessary tools to fight back against its own occupiers. Because the problem here is not the state. The problem here is the elite who have co-opted the state. And so this form of resistance is one that should really be focused on and emphasized. Another thing is the issue that of accountability. And here were the latest developments that have taken place regarding the court cases against Lebanese financial elite and political elite are really important. The fact that Governor Salemi now is an international fugitive is something that only puts pressure on the Lebanese political class and show them that they can run, but really there's no way to hide moving forward, because they have been exposed and things are well known, and be it done by international international courts, or done here in Lebanon and with an equipped judiciary. And might I remind you that a lot of cases were opened here in Lebanon by judges that they then were stopped by the political class. This is very important. Accountability should be the core approach by which we get out of the crisis. We should not clean off the slate and then say, okay, let's see what we can do now. No, someone should pay for what has been done. Lastly, I think consultations of the IMF, broadening the consultation scope to include Lebanese civil society actors, to include even more other societal groups like syndicates, labor syndicates, professional syndicates, labor unions, etc. At the end of the day, these are the people who represent the biggest social blocks that can really drive up the pressure in order to liberate Lebanon and the Lebanese economy from the current chokehold that the elite have on it. So these would be, a very summarized list of how we're approaching this issue, of what can be done and how can we move forward, and at the end of the day, really tell people that what has happened is terrible, but this is not necessarily the end of the road. What has happened is a choice and is not a fate. And people, if they see that this is a choice and reclaim their agency, can really move things around. I don't know if Sam has anything to add on this point.
Yeah, I mean, mainly just that it's the Lebanese public for whom Lebanon's IMF talks matter the most, and then who have been mostly kept in the dark on this. So I think that, hopefully this report will have a number of audiences, but certainly the main one that we had in mind was a Lebanese readership, so they can at least know, right, what's happening. I didn't know before we did this work, and then not everything that we found out was necessarily encouraging, but it was really edifying. It was useful, and so people should know, right? So I mean, at least they can hopefully they can have a say in what's next for the country.
Yeah, I mean, this is the goal, right? The goal is to change terrible realities into something better. And when we talked about this work, one of the things that always comes up is, what does accountability really mean? Like how do we take knowledge of wrongdoing by powerful actors and translate that into consequential changes in toxic realities, and that's something that we work on. But I really take a lot of momentum and actually some optimism from this work and from the points you two just made, especially the way Sami sort of traced a path from knowledge to accountability. Because look, ultimately, I mean, a case like Riyad Salameh, this guy just celebrated 30 years in this crook. Riyad Salameh celebrated 30 years in April as governor of Lebanon Central Bank. He's a crook, but he's a crook's crook. He's not a crook, a freelance crook doing his own crookery. He is the banker of Lebanon's ruling class, and he got to keep that job for 30 plus years because he was serving everybody's interests. And now he's going to retire as an international fugitive. He's not going to get to go and enjoy his properties in France that he bought with stolen money. And that is the beginning of accountability. And in any case where we've gone from like an unaccountable mob to something like governance, it happens after long, slow, tedious efforts that finally reach a critical mass and things change. So it might seem dispiriting to think about 30 plus years since the end of the Civil War and all these folks running amok, but it's possible that they will be held to account. And when it finally comes to pass, it'll be because of an accumulation of efforts, including the kind of research you did here. So thank you both for coming on the podcast. I've been talking with Sami Zoughaib, the research manager at the Policy Initiative, one of Lebanon's best activist think tanks, and Sam Heller, a fellow at Century International. You can read their work at the Policy Institute's website and at the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org. It's a pretty stupendous piece of work. Take a look, read it, share it, and most of all, share that sense that Sami Zoughaib talked about, that people do and can have agency over dissipate seeming disasters like Lebanon's economic crisis. So Sam and Sami, thank you so much for coming on Order from Ashes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Until next time. The Order from Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.